What do a banknote from the Bank of Senegal and another from Congo have in common? They don't look alike, but they are part of the same scheme, a scheme that subjects both currencies to the euro at a rate determined by the French Treasury. This is the pinnacle of French policy, the CFA franc. By using it, France controls the monetary sovereignty of 14 nations, nearly 200 million people. These countries include Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Chad, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Ivory Coast, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Togo, and the Central African Republic. And while these nations participate in the United Nations and wave their own flags, it's just another face of imperialism. The status has largely remained the same. The big difference is that imperialism used to be imposed with bombs, but today it's imposed with banks. Anyone can create money, the hard part is getting others to accept it. Hello to all the community of Finance for All, welcome to another video. In pre-colonial times, many African societies used cowrie shells as a medium of exchange. Cowrie shells circulated so widely that by 1800 they had an official exchange rate with the French currency. But as the French Empire dug deeper into Africa, Paris sought to monopolize production and trade. They demanded taxes in francs and sent armed troops to collect them, forcing traders to accept the French currency. By the 1930s, France had come to dominate the money supply in Francophone Africa. With this new power came new extrajudicial advantages. Paris gained access to African labor and raw materials at bargain prices, while French manufactures were sold to Africa at exorbitant prices. French neocolonialism was so intrusive, so unique, that it earned its own name, Francafrique. After World War II, however, things changed. Paris joined the Bretton Woods system, and as a result, the French franc was devalued to establish a fixed exchange rate with the dollar. These fiscal reforms took place at a time when Africa was decolonizing. A weaker currency only added fuel to the fire. So, to maintain its African possessions, France conjured a new currency in 1945 called the CFA franc and forced its colonies to adopt it. Initially, the CFA franc was pegged to its French counterpart at a rate of 1.7 to 1, but in 1948 it was increased to 2 to 1. By overvaluing the CFA franc, Paris maintained its economic advantage while crushing the competitiveness of African exports. Thus, in a way, France cemented its post-war recovery partly through Africa. Still, the most effective forms of control are those that are invisible. Recognizing this, in 1958 France undermined genuine decolonization by installing local collaborators and granting them statehood. These collaborators became the custodians of France's neo-colonial empire, maintaining the franc and French military bases. Only Guinea rejected the offer. Its leader, Sékou Touré, declared that his people preferred to be poor in freedom rather than rich in slavery. Guinea thus rejected the CFA franc, seeking to develop its own currency. France felt the need to make an example of Guinea, so it cut pensions to war veterans, dismantled the electrical grid, and then tried to block its entry into the UN. France took this to the extreme of inducing hyperinflation by flooding the country with counterfeit banknotes, all while funding anti-government armed groups. Yes, they went overboard. The plan ultimately failed to oust Touré, but Guinea's economy never fully recovered. Similarly, when Togo changed its mind and tried to rid itself of the CFA franc, Togo's leader, Sylvanus Olympio, was assassinated in January 1963. French involvement is suspected, but the official records remain conveniently classified. More attempts to conceal French imperialism followed. The CFA franc was divided into two currencies covering the states of Central and West Africa. By the mid-1970s, their respective central banks were Africanized and relocated to Yaoundé and Dakar. Although African locals filled the staff of these institutions, there were no fundamental political changes, and France retained veto power over the bank statutes. This included the requirement that member states deposit half of their foreign exchange reserves with the French Treasury, plus another 20% for financial liabilities, meaning that member states retained access to only 30% of their money. Moreover, all currency conversions had to pass through the French Treasury. This fiscal policy operates through operations accounts, special accounts held in the French Treasury. The denominations are in euros, but when the accounts are in credit, African central banks effectively make their foreign exchange reserves available to France. But when the central bank's accounts are in debit, they are obliged to pay interest to the French state. In other words, the CFA member states pay France to keep their money. Even more troubling, no one knows what France does with that money. The French Treasury does not disclose this information, not even to the CFA Franc nations. Therefore, it would not be extraordinary if France reinvested the African funds for its own benefit. No matter how you look at it, the CFA scheme is a cash generator for France. French companies benefit just as much as the French Treasury. More specifically, France does not need to draw on its foreign exchange reserves for African imports. Dozens of French multinationals are present in Africa, including Total Energies, Arriva, and Vinci. Africa also grants France access to strategic resources, such as uranium, which is indispensable for the French nuclear energy sector and meets 3/4 of France's energy needs. Meanwhile, Gabon is a source of crude oil, Mauritania offers iron ore, while Togo and Benin provide agricultural products. Additionally, the icing on the cake, French citizen Vincent Bolloré owns most of the major ports in West Africa. It is no coincidence that former French President Jacques Chirac once said that much of the money in French banks comes precisely from exploiting Africa and that France would lose its global standing without its African empire. To preserve its hegemony, France has intervened militarily on the continent 40 times since the 1960s, from supporting corrupt dictators to conducting military operations in the Sahel. Furthermore, the CFA Franc configurations allow profits and capital to be repatriated with ease. Between 1970 and 2010, Côte d'Ivoire lost $40 billion due to capital flight, which could have reduced poverty by 10% annually if reinvested internally. Meanwhile, Equatorial Guinea and Congo, the main oil producers, transferred the equivalent of 43% and 30% of their respective GDPs between 2000 and 2009. Similar trends are present in Gabon and Cameroon. While its defenders point to the stability of the CFA franc, the lack of monetary sovereignty restricts the tools available to member states. For example, Côte d'Ivoire's inflation rate is about 6%, compared to 29% in neighboring Ghana, but the latter's extreme poverty rate is only 13%, compared to 30% in Côte d'Ivoire. CFA member states also lag in terms of growth, some are even regressing. Côte d'Ivoire's real per capita GDP is 1/3 lower than in 1978. In 2016, Senegal was at its 1960 level. Meanwhile, Cameroon, Congo, and Gabon have not surpassed their respective peaks of 1986, 1984, and 1976. This means that these countries have had little to no real economic growth in decades. But change is the only certainty in life. In recent years, CFA member states have started to publicly discuss alternatives, a trend that is growing stronger. The most feasible proposal is to form a regional monetary bloc without ties to French control. Some proponents of this plan would use the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, as a springboard, reorienting CFA member states around Nigeria, which accounts for more than 2/3 of the regional GDP. Additionally, Nigeria is a net exporter of oil, while most West African states are importers, creating a natural synergy within the ECOWAS zone. Of course, this will not be easy. Paris has tried to prevent these attempts. A law to that effect was passed by the French Senate in January 2021, aiming to replace the West African CFA franc with the ECO, abolish operations accounts, and withdraw French staff from central banks. All of this is to be completed by 2027, but Paris would still maintain effective control, and the issue of where African monetary reserves would be held remains unaddressed. It is safe to say that the most recent French reform is just a ploy. Ultimately, the best solution might be for each state to have its own central banks and currencies, pegged to a common regional unit at an adjustable rate. This would grant monetary sovereignty to 14 nations or nearly 200 million people. But many still fear confronting France, and with good reason. Any attempt to break away from French hegemony would require a joint effort across the CFA zone. Above all, the African collaborating elites who benefit from the system would need to be sidelined and replaced by leaders determined to pursue a path of autonomous development. This could prove the biggest hurdle, and it is something that needs to change from within. Now that we've reached this point, what do you think about this situation? Leave us your opinion below in the comments section.